Picture this. It's 2 in the morning in the 12th century. The world lies shrouded in absolute darkness. No streetlights pierce the night. No electric hum disturbs the silence. Yet within the stone walls of medieval monasteries, shadowy figures move through dimly lit corridors. Hooded silhouettes glide past ancient archways, their footsteps echoing against cold stone floors. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about religious life in the Middle Ages. Whether you're listening from your bedroom, driving through the night, or walking alone under the stars, prepare yourself for a journey into the hidden world that existed behind monastery walls when darkness fell. For centuries, historians have painted a sanitized picture of medieval monastic life, one of prayer, contemplation, and simple devotion. But the truth is far more complex, far more human, and infinitely more mysterious. Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on the secret nocturnal world of monks and nuns. We'll explore the forbidden relationships, the scandals that rocked entire kingdoms, the supernatural terrors that haunted medieval minds, and the shocking realities of what really happened when the sun went down in medieval monasteries. Before we begin this descent into the shadows of history, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. These stories deserve to be heard. And now, let us step through the gates of time into a world where the sacred and the profane dance together in the darkness of medieval nights. The bell tower strikes twice in the dead of night. In the 12th century monastery of Cluny, Brother Thomas jolts awake in his narrow cell. The year is 1147, and like every night for the past 2 decades, he must rise from his straw mattress to join his brothers for matines, the most demanding of all the canonical hours. But this isn't simply about getting up early. Medieval monks faced a brutal reality that would challenge even the most dedicated modern practitioners. In winter, temperatures inside these stone buildings plummeted below freezing. There was no heating, no comfort, no mercy from the elements. Yet every single night, without exception, these men and women rose at what we would consider the middle of the night to begin their spiritual duties. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, demanded that monks interrupt their sleep to praise God during the darkest hours. At night, Benedict wrote, they must rise to praise God. But what the rule didn't capture was the sheer physical and psychological toll this took on human beings, living in an age when night meant absolute vulnerability. To understand why this mattered so profoundly, you must understand what night meant in medieval times. This wasn't our modern night, softened by electric lights and heated homes. Medieval night was a realm of terror, populated by demons, wild beasts, and human predators. The very darkness was believed to be Satan's domain. Yet into this realm of fear, monks and nuns ventured every single night as part of their sacred duty. The ingenious solutions they developed to survive these nocturnal challenges reveal remarkable adaptability. Some monastic orders developed the practice of sleeping fully clothed, their heads buried under their hoods. This wasn't merely for warmth, though the cold was certainly brutal. It was a tactical decision that allowed them to move quickly from sleep to prayer without the vulnerable moments of dressing in the dark. The measurement of time itself became an art form. Without mechanical clocks, monks relied on candles that burned for exactly 3 hours. The brother assigned to watch duty would light these specially crafted candles and know precisely when to ring the bell for matins. These weren't ordinary candles. They were carefully measured and tested, their burn rate calculated to provide accurate timekeeping in an age when precision meant the difference between proper observance and spiritual failure. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. The chronicles of Raoul Glaber, a monk writing around 1030, provide us with intimate details of what these nocturnal experiences actually felt like. Glaber describes waking in the dead of night, his breath visible in the frigid air, the monastery corridor stretching before him like a pathway to another world. The darkness, he wrote, was not empty. It moved with purposes we could not understand. This wasn't poetic language. This was the reality of medieval perception. The night offices weren't just religious observances. They were acts of courage. Every movement through darkened corridors, every step down stone stairs worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, required monks and nuns to confront their deepest fears. The church itself transformed at night. During daylight hours, it was a place of communal worship, filled with familiar faces and comforting rituals. But at 2 a.m., illuminated only by flickering oil lamps and candles, the same space became otherworldly. Shadows danced across stone saints' faces, making them appear to move. The vaulted ceilings disappeared into blackness, creating the impression of infinite space above. Archaeological evidence from medieval monasteries reveals another fascinating detail. Many churches contained special niches built specifically for night lighting. These weren't random architectural features. They were carefully planned systems designed to provide just enough illumination for the complex choreography of nocturnal worship while preserving the atmosphere of mystery and reverence that darkness provided. The psychological impact of these practices shaped entire generations of religious practitioners. Modern sleep research tells us that fragmenting sleep in this way would have created a unique state of consciousness, neither fully awake nor properly rested. Medieval chroniclers describe a dreamy, heightened awareness that came from years of interrupted sleep patterns. Some scholars now believe this created conditions particularly conducive to the mystical experiences that medieval religious figures frequently reported. But the nocturnal offices served another purpose entirely, one that the official religious texts rarely acknowledge. They provided cover for activities that couldn't happen during daylight hours. The legitimate movement of monks and nuns through monastery corridors at night created opportunities for clandestine meetings, secret communications, and activities that would have been impossible during the strictly regulated daylight schedule. Contemporary accounts reveal that some monasteries developed elaborate systems of signals and codes used during the night offices. A particular way of holding a candle, a specific pattern of footsteps, even the arrangement of prayer books could convey messages between individuals who were forbidden to speak directly. These nocturnal communications networks sometimes carried information that had nothing to do with spiritual matters and everything to do with the complex political and economic realities of medieval monastery life. The acoustic properties of medieval churches created another layer of mystery. The stone architecture that made these buildings magnificent during the day transformed them into acoustic chambers at night. Every whisper echoed, every footstep was amplified, every breath became audible. This meant that conversations thought to be private were often overheard, creating a web of secrets and surveillance that operated under the cover of religious observance. But perhaps most remarkably, evidence suggests that some monasteries used the cover of night offices to conduct activities that would have been considered scandalous or even heretical if discovered. The legitimate need for certain monks and nuns to move through the buildings at night provided perfect cover for meetings between individuals who should have had no contact with each other. Yet this is only the beginning of our journey into the hidden world of medieval monastic nights. The official prayers and rituals were just the surface layer of a much more complex reality. The year is 1165, and within the walls of Watton Priory in Yorkshire, a scandal is unfolding that will shock the medieval world and leave echoes that reverberate through history. What happened there on those dark medieval nights reveals the explosive tension between human nature and religious vows, a tension that erupted in ways so dramatic they seem almost fictional. The story begins innocently enough. A 4-year-old girl, entrusted to the care of the Gilbertine community at Watton, grows up within the monastery walls. By adolescence, she has known no other life than the religious community that raised her. But as she reaches womanhood, something forbidden begins to bloom in the darkness of those medieval nights. The young nun, whose name has been lost to history, begins meeting secretly with a canon of the monastery. These weren't chance encounters, they were carefully planned assignations that took place during the hours when the rest of the community was supposed to be sleeping. The couple used their intimate knowledge of the monastery's routines to create opportunities for forbidden intimacy. But medieval monasteries were surveillance states, and secrets had a way of coming to light. When the sister's pregnancy became impossible to hide, the discovery unleashed a fury that reveals the barely controlled violence lurking beneath the surface of medieval religious life. The other nuns, discovering the affair, didn't simply report it to their superiors. They took justice into their own hands with a brutality that would shock modern sensibilities. They captured the young canon and, in a scene that defies belief, forced the pregnant nun to castrate her lover with her own hands. This wasn't symbolic punishment. This was literal, physical mutilation, carried out by women who were supposed to embody Christian mercy and forgiveness. The violence of their response reveals the intense sexual frustration and psychological pressure that built up within these supposedly peaceful communities. But the story doesn't end there. According to the account written by Aelred of Rievaulx, the castrated canon didn't die from his injuries. Instead, he was kept alive as a living testament to the consequences of breaking celibacy vows. The pregnant nun, meanwhile, experienced what was described as a miraculous intervention. The pregnancy disappeared without explanation, leaving no physical evidence of the affair that had caused such chaos. This miracle was interpreted as divine forgiveness, but modern historians suspect a more earthly explanation. The trauma of witnessing and participating in such violence may have caused a miscarriage, or the pregnancy may have been terminated through methods that medieval sources preferred not to discuss openly. The Watton scandal wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of sexual transgression and violent response that characterized medieval monastic life far more often than the sanitized historical accounts suggest. The very intensity of the punishment reveals how common such lapses actually were. Moving forward nearly 4 centuries, we encounter another scandal that pulls back the curtain on the reality of monastic nightlife. At Littlemore Priory in Oxfordshire, the early 16th century brought revelations that would contribute to the dissolution of monasteries under Henry VIII. Catherine Wells, the prioress of Littlemore, had turned the small, impoverished priory into what contemporary observers described as something closer to a house of ill repute than a religious institution. But what makes her story particularly relevant to our exploration of medieval nights is how she used the cover of darkness to conduct activities that would have been impossible during daylight hours. Wells regularly received men in her private chambers after the evening prayers had ended, and the community was supposed to be in silent contemplation. These weren't spiritual conferences. They were drinking parties that often lasted until dawn. The prioress and her guests consumed alcohol in quantities that left them incapacitated, creating a situation where normal monastic discipline completely broke down. But Wells went beyond simple debauchery. She used her position to create a system of sexual coercion that targeted the women under her authority. Contemporary accounts describe how she would force nuns to participate in activities that violated every aspect of their religious vows, using physical violence and psychological manipulation to ensure compliance. The violence at Littlemore was systematic and calculated. Wells employed torture devices, including iron restraints that she used to punish nuns who resisted her demands. These punishments often took place at night, when screams would be less likely to attract attention from outside the monastery walls. One particularly disturbing account describes how Wells would drag resistant nuns from their beds in the middle of the night, forcing them into the chapel where she would beat them while demanding that they confess to sins they hadn't committed. This psychological torture was designed to break down their sense of reality and make them more compliant with her demands. The economic corruption at Littlemore was equally systematic. Wells pawned the monastery's religious artifacts to fund her lifestyle, including precious items that had been donated by faithful supporters who believed they were contributing to a holy cause. She used these funds not just for alcohol and entertainment, but to pay for the education of a child she had conceived with the monastery's chaplain. This child represents one of the most explosive aspects of medieval monastic scandals, the secret families that some religious figures maintained, despite their vows of celibacy. The existence of these children had to be carefully hidden, requiring elaborate deceptions and financial arrangements that often involved multiple members of the monastic community. But perhaps even more shocking than individual cases of sexual misconduct were the systematic relationships that developed between nuns in some medieval monasteries. Church authorities were deeply concerned about what they termed particular friendships, relationships between nuns that went beyond appropriate spiritual fellowship. Visitation records from Italian monasteries of the 16th and 17th centuries reveal the extent of these concerns. Bishops conducting formal inspections would specifically inquire about nuns who slept in the same cell, who showed excessive affection toward each other, or who were observed embracing, holding hands, and walking through the monastery together. These relationships weren't always sexual, but they represented a form of emotional intimacy that church authorities viewed as threatening to proper religious discipline. The fact that so much effort was devoted to detecting and preventing such relationships suggests they were far more common than official sources acknowledge. The sleeping arrangements in medieval monasteries created particular opportunities for intimate relationships. Despite official rules requiring separate cells, practical considerations often meant that nuns shared sleeping spaces. In winter, sharing body heat was sometimes a matter of survival in unheated stone buildings. But these practical necessities created opportunities for relationships that went beyond simple companionship. Archaeological evidence from medieval nunneries reveals that many supposedly individual cells were actually designed as shared spaces. Double beds, shared storage areas, and communication passages between supposedly separate chambers suggest that the official rules about individual dormitories were more theoretical than practical. The emotional intensity of these relationships sometimes led to dramatic consequences. Records from various monasteries describe cases of nuns attempting to leave religious life to follow particular companions, or engaging in violent confrontations when relationships were discovered and interrupted by authorities. One particularly revealing case from 13th century France describes two nuns who attempted to flee their monastery together, disguised in male clothing. They were captured before reaching the monastery gates, but their escape attempt required months of careful planning and the cooperation of sympathetic members of their community. The psychological pressure of maintaining these secret relationships within the highly regulated environment of medieval monasteries created situations of extreme emotional volatility. Some nuns described experiencing visions and mystical states that modern psychologists would likely interpret as responses to severe emotional stress and sexual frustration. But the most disturbing aspect of these monastic scandals may be how they reveal the complete breakdown of the systems that were supposed to protect vulnerable individuals. Young women entered monasteries often without any real choice in the matter, only to find themselves trapped in environments where abuse was systematic and escape was nearly impossible. The night provided cover for these abuses, but it also created opportunities for resistance. Secret communications networks allowed victims to share information and sometimes to coordinate escape attempts. The same darkness that enabled predatory behavior also provided protection for those brave enough to fight back. But even these resistance efforts reveal the deeper truth about medieval monastic life. It was a system built on the suppression of fundamental human needs and desires. When that suppression failed, as it inevitably did, the results were often explosive and sometimes violent. The scandals we've explored represent only the documented cases, the situations that became so serious they couldn't be hidden or ignored. For every recorded scandal, there were likely dozens of smaller transgressions, secret relationships, and quiet rebellions that never made it into the historical record. This hidden world of forbidden desires and secret relationships existed alongside the official religious observances we explored earlier. The same corridors that echoed with Gregorian chant also witnessed passionate encounters, violent confrontations, and desperate escape attempts. But the darkness held even deeper secrets than human passion and institutional corruption. The medieval night was populated by fears and superstitions that seem almost fantastical to modern minds, yet they were absolutely real to the people who lived through them. The official records speak of poverty, obedience, and contemplation. But hidden within the account books, personal letters, and private documents of medieval monasteries lies evidence of a completely different reality, one of secret wealth, political manipulation, and social networks that operated entirely outside the official religious structure. Sister Marguerite de Montclair keeps meticulous records in her private ledger, hidden beneath the floorboards of her cell at the Abbey of Fontevraud. The year is 1284, and what she documents would scandalize anyone who believed in the official narrative of monastic poverty. Her personal wealth, accumulated through a complex network of financial arrangements, rivals that of minor nobility. But more shocking than the wealth itself is how she uses the cover of religious life to conduct business that would be impossible for a secular woman. The concept of sweet rents, literally sweetness rents, provided wealthy women entering monasteries with a legal mechanism to maintain their standard of living while appearing to embrace religious poverty. These weren't simple dowries, but sophisticated financial instruments that ensured privileged nuns could access luxury goods, private servants, and comfortable accommodations, while technically adhering to their vows of poverty. But these financial arrangements went far beyond simple personal comfort. They created economic networks that connected monasteries to the broader commercial and political systems of medieval Europe. Wealthy nuns often served as silent partners in commercial ventures, using their religious status to provide legitimacy and protection for business activities that might otherwise attract unwanted attention from secular authorities. The Abbey of Sainte-Croix in Poitiers provides a particularly revealing example of how these systems operated. During the late 13th century, the nuns maintained what appeared to be a simple herb garden for medicinal purposes. In reality, they were operating a sophisticated pharmaceutical operation that supplied expensive and rare medicines to wealthy clients throughout France. The herb garden included plants that had been smuggled from the Middle East and carefully cultivated under conditions of absolute secrecy. Some of these plants were used to create medicines that were technically illegal under church law: contraceptives, abortifacients, and psychoactive substances that were in high demand among the medieval elite. The nuns had developed elaborate distribution networks that used pilgrimage routes and religious festivals as cover for their commercial activities. Medicines were packaged in religious containers and delivered by individuals who appeared to be simple religious messengers, but were actually sophisticated commercial agents. The profits from these operations funded not only the comfortable lifestyle of the participating nuns, but also political activities that extended far beyond the monastery walls. Some convents used their commercial wealth to influence episcopal elections, support particular candidates for secular political positions, and even fund military activities during periods of political conflict. Sister Catherine de Bourbon, a member of the royal family who entered the convent of Longchamp in 1286, maintained a private correspondence network that rivaled the intelligence operations of major secular rulers. Her letters, written in coded language and delivered through seemingly religious channels, carried information about political developments, military movements, and commercial opportunities throughout Europe. These intelligence networks were possible because nuns and monks could travel between religious institutions without arousing the suspicion that would have surrounded secular messengers. A nun carrying a letter from one abbess to another appeared to be engaged in routine religious business, but she might actually be conveying information of tremendous political or commercial value. The most dramatic example of these hidden activities occurred in 1523, when 12 nuns escaped from the Cistercian convent of Nimschen near Grimma in Saxony. What appeared to be a religious conversion to Lutheran principles was actually a carefully planned operation that had been months in the making. The escape was organized by Leonhard Koppe, a respected merchant from Torgau who regularly delivered supplies to the convent. But Koppe wasn't acting from religious conviction. He was part of a commercial network that included several of the escaping nuns and their families. The conversion provided cover for dissolving financial obligations and redirecting resources to new commercial ventures. The logistics of the escape reveal the sophisticated planning capabilities that existed within medieval convents. The nuns had to coordinate their departure with external allies, arrange for transportation and safe houses, and time their escape to coincide with religious observances that would provide maximum distraction for their supervisors. The fact that they successfully removed 12 individuals from a supposedly secure religious institution suggests that they had inside knowledge of guard schedules, access to keys or knowledge of alternative exits, and communication systems that allowed them to coordinate complex activities without detection. But perhaps most revealing is what happened to the escaped nuns afterward. Rather than simply disappearing into secular life, many of them became prominent figures in the economic and political networks of their regions. Their religious training had provided them with literacy, numerical skills, and social connections that made them valuable assets in the developing commercial economy of 16th century Europe. The convent had served not as a prison but as a kind of finishing school that prepared these women for roles they could never have played as conventional wives and mothers. Their religious education included languages, accounting, legal knowledge, and social skills that were normally available only to male members of the elite. This educational function of medieval convents represents one of their most important but least recognized contributions to European development. While secular women were generally excluded from formal education, nuns routinely achieved levels of literacy and numerical competency that exceeded those of most male nobles. The scriptorium activities of medieval convents went far beyond simply copying religious texts. Nuns produced legal documents, commercial contracts, personal correspondence, and even secular literature. Their skills as scribes and illuminators made them essential participants in the developing book trade that was transforming medieval intellectual life. Some convents operated essentially as commercial publishing houses, producing both religious and secular manuscripts for sale to wealthy clients. The high quality of their work and their reputation for discretion made them preferred suppliers for individuals who wanted sensitive documents produced without attracting unwanted attention. The Abbey of Heiligkreuz in Austria maintained a scriptorium that produced erotic literature for wealthy clients who couldn't obtain such materials through normal commercial channels. The nuns used their religious status to avoid the legal consequences that would have faced secular producers of similar content. But the most sophisticated operations involved the production of forged documents, papal bulls, royal charters, and commercial contracts that provided legal legitimacy for activities that couldn't be supported through normal channels. The technical skills required for such forgeries were considerable, and convents provided ideal training environments for developing these capabilities. The political connections maintained by medieval convents extended to the highest levels of secular and religious authority. Abbesses often came from the most powerful families in Europe, and maintained their political influence even after entering religious life. These connections were used not just for personal advantage, but to advance complex political agendas that spanned multiple kingdoms. The Abbess Matilda of Quedlinburg, who ruled her community during the late 10th century, maintained direct correspondence with the Holy Roman Emperor and several other European rulers. Her letters reveal that she was actively involved in military planning, diplomatic negotiations, and economic policy decisions that affected the entire region. These political activities were facilitated by the unique legal status of medieval abbesses, who often held feudal rights equivalent to those of male nobles. They could command military forces, collect taxes, and exercise judicial authority over substantial territories. The religious nature of their position provided legitimacy for political activities that might have been controversial if undertaken by secular women. The economic power of medieval convents extended far beyond their official landholdings and donations. Many communities operated what were essentially banks, providing loans and financial services to individuals who couldn't access credit through secular channels. The religious nature of these transactions allowed them to circumvent church prohibitions on usury while providing essential financial services. The Abbey of Las Huelgas in Spain maintained financial operations that extended throughout the Mediterranean, providing letters of credit for merchants, pilgrims, and even military expeditions. Their financial instruments were accepted by commercial partners in Italy, France, and North Africa, making them significant players in international commerce. These banking operations required sophisticated understanding of international exchange rates, commercial law, and market conditions. The nuns developed expertise that rivaled that of the great merchant families of northern Italy, but their religious status provided them with legal protections and social legitimacy that purely secular commercial operators couldn't achieve. The overnight accommodation services provided by medieval monasteries created opportunities for intelligence gathering and political networking that extended far beyond simple hospitality. Travelers staying at monasteries often shared information about political developments, military movements, and commercial opportunities that the religious communities could use for their own purposes. Some monasteries maintained what were essentially intelligence operations, systematically gathering information from travelers and using it to support their political and commercial activities. The religious obligation to provide hospitality provided perfect cover for what were actually sophisticated information-gathering operations. The most dramatic example of these hidden networks occurred during the Hundred Years' War, when several French convents served as communication centers for resistance activities against English occupation. The nuns used their religious status to move freely through occupied territory, carrying messages and coordinating activities that would have been impossible for secular resistance fighters. But these political and commercial activities were just the visible surface of even deeper secrets that lay hidden within medieval monastic communities. In the deepest vaults beneath the Abbey of Saint-Denis, Brother Guillaume discovers something that shouldn't exist. The year is 1301, and what he finds hidden behind a false wall will challenge everything medieval Christianity claims to know about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. The manuscript he uncovers is written in a hand he recognizes, that of Sister Apollonia, who died 3 years earlier. But the text describes events that occurred after her death. This discovery launches us into the most mysterious and disturbing aspects of medieval monastic life, the phenomena that even contemporary witnesses struggled to explain, and that modern historians prefer to ignore rather than confront. The manuscript Guillaume found wasn't simply posthumous writing. It was impossibly detailed knowledge of events that occurred throughout the abbey after Sister Apollonia's burial. She described conversations between specific individuals, described the contents of letters that arrived weeks after her death, and provided accurate accounts of political developments that no one within the abbey walls could have known. But Sister Apollonia's case wasn't unique. Medieval monasteries across Europe documented similar phenomena, cases of deceased community members who appeared to continue participating in monastic life long after their physical deaths. These weren't simple ghost sightings, but complex, ongoing interactions that suggested the boundary between life and death operated differently within religious communities. The Abbey of Cluny maintained what they called the Liber Viventium Mortuorum, the Book of the Living Dead. This secret record, kept by a succession of trusted monks, documented cases of community members who had died but continued to appear at religious services, participate in community meetings, and even perform physical labor within the monastery. Brother Aldrich of Cluny, writing in 1156, describes encountering Sister Beatrice in the monastery garden a full 6 months after her funeral. She was tending to herb beds with the same meticulous care she had shown in life, and when he spoke to her, she responded with detailed instructions about plant care that proved to be remarkably effective. But when he returned the next day to continue their conversation, he found only her grave marker in the monastery cemetery. These encounters weren't hallucinations or misidentifications. Multiple witnesses often observed the same deceased individuals simultaneously, and their appearances frequently provided information or assistance that had practical, verifiable results. The Abbey's records show that agricultural techniques suggested by deceased nuns consistently produced better harvests than conventional methods. The phenomenon became so common at some monasteries that communities developed protocols for interacting with their deceased members. The Abbey of Fontevraud created specific seating areas in their chapel for departed community members, and Abbey records show that these seats were regularly observed to be occupied during religious services. But perhaps most disturbing were the cases of anticipated death, situations where living community members began exhibiting the characteristics of the deceased before they had actually died. These individuals would gradually become less visible to other community members. Their voices would become harder to hear, and they would begin demonstrating knowledge of events occurring in other locations. Sister Marguerite of Poissy spent the final 3 months of her life describing in perfect detail the daily activities occurring at the Abbey of Saint-Antoine, located over 200 miles away. The most chilling accounts describe individuals who seem to exist simultaneously in multiple states, appearing normally to some community members while being completely invisible to others. These partial manifestations created situations where conversations would appear to outside observers as individuals talking to empty air, while the participants experienced normal social interaction. Medieval monastery record-keeping reveals another category of impossible phenomena: the preservation of knowledge that should have been lost. Libraries that were destroyed by fire or warfare would sometimes reconstruct themselves, with manuscripts reappearing that had been verified as destroyed. The Library of Monte Cassino experienced multiple destructions during the medieval period, yet scholars consistently reported finding texts that should no longer have existed. These recovered manuscripts weren't copies. They showed the specific marginalia, damage patterns, and individual characteristics of the original texts that had been witnessed being destroyed. Brother Thomas of Monte Cassino documented a particularly striking example in 1349. A manuscript containing the private spiritual diary of a monk who had died 50 years earlier appeared on his writing desk. Despite the fact that the original had been personally verified as destroyed during a Viking raid in 1322, the recovered text included entries that extended beyond the date of the original manuscript's destruction, suggesting that somehow the text had continued to be written by its deceased author. These mysterious manuscript appearances weren't random occurrences but seemed to follow patterns related to the spiritual needs of the communities. Texts that appeared were consistently those that contained information relevant to current problems or challenges facing the monastery. Medical texts would appear during disease outbreaks, agricultural guides would materialize during famines, and theological works would manifest during periods of spiritual crisis. The phenomenon extended beyond simple texts to include architectural knowledge that enabled communities to construct buildings using techniques that no living person understood. The Abbey of Saint Riquier rebuilt their church after a devastating fire, using construction methods that weren't documented in any available sources, yet the resulting structure proved more durable and acoustically superior to buildings constructed using conventional medieval techniques. Master builder Hugh de Montfort, working at Saint Riquier in 1287, documented receiving detailed architectural guidance from what he described as the voices of former master builders who had worked on sacred buildings throughout Christendom. These voices provided specific, technical instructions that enabled construction techniques requiring mathematical knowledge that significantly exceeded the educational background of anyone in the community. The resulting architectural innovations included structural elements that wouldn't be discovered by secular builders for several centuries. Archaeological analysis of surviving medieval monasteries reveals construction techniques that appear to anticipate engineering principles that weren't formally understood until the Renaissance period. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of medieval monastic life involved the systematic study of what contemporary sources called the hidden arts. Despite official church prohibition of occult practices, many monasteries maintained secret libraries containing alchemical texts, astrological calculations, and magical formulae that represented the most advanced scientific knowledge of their time. The monastery of San Lorenzo de El Escorial maintained a hidden scriptorium where monks copied and preserved texts that had been officially banned by church authorities. Their collection included works on alchemy, astrology, medicine, and natural philosophy that represented the accumulated knowledge of classical antiquity and the Islamic world. These texts weren't simply preserved as historical curiosities. They were actively studied and used for practical purposes. Monastic alchemists developed medical preparations that were significantly more effective than conventional treatments, agricultural techniques that consistently produced superior results, and architectural methods that created buildings of exceptional durability and beauty. Brother Albertus of Cologne, working in the mid-13th century, developed alchemical processes that enabled the creation of pigments for manuscript illumination that retained their brilliance for centuries longer than conventional materials. His techniques produced colors that seemed to glow with internal light, creating visual effects that modern materials science still struggles to replicate. The practical applications of these hidden studies extended to metallurgy, creating alloys for bells and religious artifacts that produced acoustic properties that enhanced the spiritual impact of religious ceremonies. The bells of Notre Dame de Paris, cast using techniques developed by monastic metallurgists, produce harmonic resonances that create measurable physiological effects in listeners. Some monasteries developed what could only be described as experimental laboratories, where monks and nuns conducted systematic investigations into natural phenomena. The Abbey of Hildegard of Bingen operated what was essentially a medieval research institution, studying botany, medicine, astronomy, and what would now be called psychology. Hildegard's community documented the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants, developed surgical techniques that wouldn't be officially recognized for centuries, and created astronomical observations that provided the foundation for later developments in calendar reform and navigation. But their most remarkable achievement was the development of what they called spiritual medicine, treatment methods that addressed the psychological and emotional aspects of illness rather than simply physical symptoms. Their approach to mental health was centuries ahead of conventional medieval understanding and produced results that attracted patients from throughout Europe. The monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland maintained what amounted to a medieval university with specialized schools for music, mathematics, medicine, and natural philosophy. Their curriculum included subjects that were officially forbidden by church authorities, but their isolation and religious status provided protection from investigation. Students at St. Gall studied Arabic mathematical texts, learned astronomical calculation methods developed in Islamic Spain, and practiced medical techniques that combined classical Greek knowledge with contemporary Islamic advances. The synthesis of knowledge that occurred at St. Gall represents one of the most important but least recognized contributions to European intellectual development. The musical innovations developed at medieval monasteries went far beyond simple liturgical chant to include complex harmonic theories that wouldn't be officially recognized until the Renaissance. Some communities developed polyphonic techniques that created acoustic effects described by contemporary witnesses as transcendent or supernatural. The Abbey of Saint Martial de Limoges developed musical compositions that incorporated mathematical relationships between tones that produced measurable physiological effects in listeners. Their compositions could induce states of consciousness that enhanced meditation, promoted healing, and created communal experiences of transcendence that strengthened community bonds. Archaeological investigation of medieval monasteries has revealed architectural features that suggest some communities understood acoustic principles that weren't formally recognized until modern times. Chamber designs, passageway angles, and ceiling configurations that create specific sound effects that enhance the impact of musical and spoken performances. The most mysterious acoustic phenomena involve chambers that seem to amplify whispered conversations while completely suppressing normal speech levels. These rooms would have enabled completely private communication even in the presence of potential eavesdroppers, suggesting that some communities had access to acoustic engineering knowledge that far exceeded official medieval understanding. But the deepest mystery of medieval monastic life may involve what contemporary sources called the art of memory, techniques for preserving and transmitting knowledge that didn't depend on written texts. Some communities developed memory systems that enabled individuals to retain vast amounts of information with perfect accuracy over decades. These memory techniques weren't simply mnemonic devices, but sophisticated psychological methods that created permanent changes in cognitive function. Masters of the art of memory could retain entire libraries worth of information, perform complex calculations without external aids, and access knowledge with a speed and accuracy that seemed superhuman to contemporary observers. The training required to develop these capabilities was intensive and secretive, passed down through carefully selected lineages of teachers and students. The process involved meditation techniques, dietary practices, and mental exercises that fundamentally altered brain function in ways that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Some individuals who mastered these techniques demonstrated abilities that approached what would now be called photographic memory, but with additional capabilities that included perfect recall of emotional states, sensory experiences, and even the psychological perspectives of other individuals. The most advanced practitioners could apparently access the memories of deceased community members, creating a form of collective consciousness that preserved the accumulated knowledge and experience of entire monastic lineages. This ability enabled communities to maintain continuity of knowledge and practice, even through periods of disruption, persecution, or social upheaval. These memory adepts served as living libraries, preserving not just information but the context and understanding necessary to use that information effectively. They maintained the practical knowledge needed for architecture, agriculture, medicine, and spiritual practice that enabled medieval monasteries to function as centers of learning and innovation. But perhaps most remarkably, these techniques enabled some individuals to project their consciousness beyond the physical limitations of their immediate environment. Advanced practitioners could apparently observe events occurring at distant locations, communicate with individuals who were not physically present, and access information that had no normal source. The implications of these capabilities for understanding medieval monastic life are profound. Communities that possess such abilities would have had access to information networks that operated entirely outside conventional communication systems. They could coordinate activities across vast distances, gather intelligence about political and economic developments, and maintain connections with allies and supporters without relying on physical messengers. These hidden capabilities help explain how medieval monasteries managed to accumulate wealth, maintain political influence, and preserve knowledge through periods when such achievements should have been impossible given their official isolation from secular society. But the most unsettling possibility is that some of these mysterious phenomena weren't the result of exceptional human abilities, but represented contact with forms of consciousness that exist outside normal human experience. Contemporary accounts consistently describe encounters with entities that possessed knowledge and capabilities that exceeded anything that could be explained by conventional medieval understanding. These encounters weren't interpreted as supernatural experiences but as normal aspects of advanced spiritual practice. The entities were understood to be elevated forms of consciousness that had evolved beyond physical limitations while remaining connected to the material world through their association with sacred locations and practices. The practical knowledge provided by these entities enabled medieval monasteries to achieve results that modern science still struggles to replicate. Their agricultural techniques produced sustainable abundance. Their architectural methods created structures of exceptional durability and beauty, and their medical practices achieved healing results that approached what would now be called miraculous. But these achievements came with costs that contemporary witnesses struggled to articulate but clearly understood. The individuals who developed these advanced capabilities often became progressively detached from normal human relationships and concerns. They retained their human form but seemed to operate according to different priorities and perspectives that sometimes conflicted with conventional human needs. The communities that developed these practices had to balance the benefits of enhanced capabilities against the risk of losing their essential humanity. Some monasteries established strict limitations on how far individuals could pursue these advanced practices, while others seemed to have allowed unlimited development regardless of the personal consequences. The records suggest that some individuals who fully developed these capabilities essentially transcended human limitations while retaining their physical presence within the monastic community. They continued to participate in community life, but operated according to perspectives and priorities that made them more like benevolent alien observers than conventional human beings. These transformed individuals served as bridges between normal human consciousness and whatever forms of awareness exist beyond physical limitations. Their presence within monastic communities provided access to knowledge and capabilities that enabled remarkable achievements, but also created psychological and spiritual challenges that tested the stability of entire communities. The legacy of these mysterious practices continues to influence religious and spiritual traditions around the world, though the specific techniques and understanding that enabled medieval achievements have largely been lost or deliberately suppressed by religious authorities who feared their implications for conventional theological doctrine. As our journey through the hidden world of medieval monastic knights draws to a close, we find ourselves confronting a reality far stranger and more complex than anything the official histories dare to acknowledge. What began as an exploration of religious practices has revealed a hidden civilization that operated parallel to the conventional medieval world, one characterized by advanced knowledge, sophisticated technologies, and capabilities that challenge our basic understanding of human potential. The evidence we've examined, from the systematic scandals that reveal the human cost of institutional repression to the mysterious phenomena that suggest contact with forms of consciousness beyond normal human experience, paints a picture of medieval monastic life that is simultaneously more disturbing and more inspiring than traditional accounts suggest. The systematic abuse and corruption we've documented reminds us that religious institutions, despite their spiritual claims, remain human organizations subject to all the failings and weaknesses that characterize human nature. The scandals of Watton and Littlemore weren't aberrations, but symptoms of systemic problems that arose when natural human needs were suppressed in the service of impossible ideals. Yet, alongside these very human failures, we've also encountered evidence of achievements that transcend normal human limitations. The consciousness-expanding practices, the preservation of impossible knowledge, the architectural and technological innovations that exceeded contemporary understanding, all suggest that medieval monastics discovered methods for accessing capabilities that modern civilization has largely forgotten. The supernatural encounters that terrified medieval minds may have been more than simple hallucinations or cultural projections. The systematic nature of these experiences, their consistency across different communities and time periods, and their practical consequences suggest that medieval monastics may have achieved forms of contact with aspects of reality that exist beyond conventional physical limitations. The financial and political networks that operated through monastic communities reveal that these institutions weren't withdrawn from worldly concerns, but were deeply embedded in the economic and political systems that shaped European development. Their influence extended far beyond the spiritual realm to encompass virtually every aspect of medieval civilization. The preservation and development of knowledge that occurred within monastic communities created the foundation for many of the scientific, technological, and cultural achievements that characterize modern civilization. Without the systematic efforts of medieval monastics, much of what we consider essential human knowledge would have been permanently lost. But perhaps most significantly, the investigation we've conducted reveals that the conventional distinction between spiritual and practical concerns is far less clear than modern assumptions suggest. The medieval monastics we've studied achieved their most remarkable results precisely by integrating spiritual awareness with practical application. Their approach to human development recognized that consciousness, community, and capability are intimately connected aspects of human potential that must be developed together rather than separately. The holistic understanding that characterized medieval monastic practice anticipated contemporary developments in psychology, neuroscience, and systems thinking that are only now being formally recognized. The methods they developed for preserving and transmitting knowledge created educational and cultural institutions that continue to shape human civilization. The financial and political innovations they pioneered provided essential tools for economic and social development. The consciousness technologies they developed offer frameworks for human potential development that remain relevant to contemporary challenges. Yet these achievements came with costs that we cannot ignore. The institutional structures that enabled remarkable accomplishments also created conditions for systematic abuse and exploitation. The pursuit of transcendent capabilities sometimes led to the abandonment of basic human needs and relationships. The integration of spiritual and practical concerns sometimes resulted in the manipulation of religious authority for purely secular purposes. The legacy of medieval monastic mysteries thus presents us with both inspiration and warning. It demonstrates the extraordinary potential that emerges when human beings commit themselves fully to systematic development of their capabilities. But it also reveals the dangers that arise when institutional power is concentrated in ways that enable the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. As we face contemporary challenges that require both practical innovation and fundamental transformation of consciousness, the medieval monastic experience offers valuable insights. Their integration of individual development with community welfare, their synthesis of spiritual awareness with practical effectiveness, and their systematic approach to knowledge preservation and transmission provide models that remain relevant to contemporary needs. But their failures also remind us that good intentions and spiritual authority are insufficient protection against human weakness and institutional corruption. The development of advanced capabilities must be balanced with safeguards that protect individual autonomy and prevent the abuse of power. The question that remains as we conclude this investigation is whether modern civilization possesses the wisdom to learn from both the achievements and the failures of medieval monastic communities. Can we develop the systematic approaches to human potential that characterize their greatest successes while avoiding the institutional pathologies that led to their most tragic failures? The evidence suggests that the knowledge and capabilities we've explored remain accessible to contemporary practitioners who are willing to undertake the systematic development that medieval monastics pursued. The consciousness technologies, community organization methods, and knowledge preservation techniques they developed continue to offer frameworks for addressing contemporary challenges.